research topic concerns the piano works of Shostakovich. Were they art or were they propaganda? That comes up a lot when you have music from the Soviet period in Russia. My methods were a literature review, looking at historical literature from the period and looking at biographies. Also, I used a musical analysis. Now, there's two things that's going to come up in my presentation today, and it's tonality and atonality. Most of the music we listen to is based upon a scale, an asymmetrical scale of music. Because it's asymmetrical, it leads your ear back to the home note, to the center. Okay? But in the 20th century, composers started playing around with different types of scales that wouldn't necessarily lead to the same conclusion every time. For instance, the whole tone scale. It could end anywhere. It could begin anywhere. And so, because it is a symmetrical scale, you don't have the same tonal function. You don't get the same tonal harmony with those scales. Also, I used a timeline, and the timeline that I made included dates of compositions, key compositions, and also dates, historical dates that related to socialist realism, and I thought would help me understand the music better. Soviet socialist realism, this was a style of art, but it wasn't really realism. It ended up being more the realism of a utopian socialist society. They wished to create their own realism. And so when the government talked about Soviet socialist realism, they wanted one constructed according to what they wanted the people to believe. So it was a very ambiguous title. No one really knew what they wanted. The Russian Revolution was a point of hope for the Russian people at first, to get out from under the Tsar, but they soon realized that they were under a crueler system of communism. Would we ever imagine in our country, would we ever imagine here in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, our School of Music putting on a program of music and having the government come down and say, I don't like that. It was not democratic enough. I didn't see any portrayals of our national heroes. It was frivolous. It was too academic. No one can understand it. It insults the American people. We can't imagine that here. And yet, that's what happened. That's what these people were going through. That's what the government did. Culture under Lenin took a back seat to an industrial revolution. He wanted to socialize the economy and industry. And so as long as the art, the music, did not get in the way of what he was trying to do, he didn't mind if they experimented. He didn't mind what they did. But he did want it to support his progress, his economic progress. And he did nationalize conservatories, nationalize theaters. When we get to Stalin, the economy is in shambles. The new economic program didn't work. Lenin didn't get the Industrial Revolution he had hoped for. Stalin cannot hold on to the country in a communist regime using the economy only. So he turns to a cultural war. He has to use the culture to hold on to the people. And this is really where the idea of Soviet socialist realism begins to get serious. In 1936, the music community was shocked when an article appeared in the state's publication, Pravda, condemning one of their finest composers, Dmitri Shostakovich, for an opera, which he wrote a few years earlier, which was wildly successful. It was a threatening article, saying that if you do not change your ways, if you do not change your compositional style, there will be trouble. Also in 1948, there was a wider condemnation of the entire music community. But who is Dmitri Shostakovich? He was a Soviet artist. His entire career was in the period of the Soviet Union. After the revolution, his career started. This cannot be said of a lot of popular Soviet composers of that time. But they could claim him as the true Soviet artist because his career started after the revolution. He was the first major Soviet composer. Also, he was their favorite hero and their favorite villain. He was awarded Stalin medals for composition. He was publicized as a hero in World War II. They took pictures of him in a fireman's uniform in his beloved city of Leningrad, where he was never actually allowed to fight fire because they thought he was too important. But those pictures and his 7th Symphony went out all over the country and even internationally. And those were seen as the symbols of a country fighting a foreign invader. But he was reprimanded severely in 1936 and named specifically in the 1948 reprimand of the entire music community. However, despite all this, he was a successful composer. He had a long career. He worked up until the time of his death, which was unusual for an artist in this period of history, in the Soviet Union. He had international success. Now, this is interesting because of the demands of the government. A lot of composers were not able to overcome those demands to write truly artistic music. It was trite. It was propaganda. And they developed a bad reputation for it. However, Shostakovich, while he did fulfill his duty and write mass choral works, illuminating Soviet themes and celebrating special days and key political heroes, the bulk of his work was not political themed. The bulk of his work, chamber works, opera, piano works, symphonies, attracted international attention. His international success is evidence of the quality and craftsmanship of his music. This timeline is abridged. I included just the dates that specifically jumped out at me when I was looking for conclusions. You can see 1936 and 1948, where we have the really severe state interference, where they threatened the music community and Shostakovich. You also see the date of the opera, which he wrote, which was condemned in 1936. And we have the 8 preludes, 3 fantastic dances, which are tonal works. Now, I talked about tonality earlier. The Soviets wanted tonality. Atonality was too academic. They didn't feel that it met the needs of the public as far as art. They felt it was people looking down on the public, and if it couldn't be understood, it was illegal. So, when we get to Piano Sonata No. 1 and aphorisms and the opera, these are atonal works. These were works the government was not happy with. But 24 preludes, 1932 to 1933, those were tonal again. And then we have these condemnations, and then the 24 preludes and fugues in 1950, which harks back to a very, very formal academic exercise by Bach, where he wrote this cycle and included every possible key in the realm of tonal functionality, traditional tonal functionality. So very formal work. At this time, functional cadence. That sounds quite different. And now here we are back to the 24 preludes. Keep in mind that these were written before 1936. They would most likely not have seen 1936 coming, that severe reprimand in Praga. And yet, here we have the preludes. From tonality to atonality back to a beautiful, lyrical, very tonal piece in those preludes. So what are we looking at here? Here's our evidence. He transitioned back to tonality before 1936, before he was threatened by the government. But does that mean that he was really controlling his style in his pieces? Does that mean he did not submit himself to the government? And he did in a lot of ways. But I think it could have been accidental. It could have been just coincidental that he transitioned before 1936. But when we look at the formal cycle of preludes and fugues, these were written starting in 1950. I think completed in 1951. These were written after 1948, when he was once again threatened, along with the entire music community, for the sins which the government accused him of. He is still formalist. He is still not writing for the people. Eventually, a friend of his, when he was out of town, did play them again, and they were approved. But he took a risk. I believe because of those things that I can conclude that his move back to tonality was most likely his own decision, and not just a product of censure, not just placating the government's thirst for propaganda. And that's why I think that the piano works of Shostakovich were art and not propaganda.